Once upon a time, in a certain kingdom, a king ruled. This king had 7 wives, 6 of whom were very wealthy, and lived in magnificent palaces. However, the 7th queen was very poor, and lived in a small hut made of mud walls. The king paid little attention to this poor queen. One of the reasons for this was that the other queens were very jealous of her. Although the king had 7 wives, he was still childless. All of his wives were without children, and the king was constantly sad because of this. He prayed to God day and night, "O God, bless me with a son. O God, what is missing in your house?" His wives, too, lamented their fate. But in the face of destiny, they were helpless and powerless. They could only shed tears and silently prayed for their wombs to bear children. And so the days passed by. One day, the king went hunting outside the city. While hunting, he wandered deep into the forest, away from his servants. There, he saw an old beggar sleeping soundly. What the king didn't know was that this beggar slept for 12 years, and then stayed awake for 12 years. When the king approached him, the beggar had already completed 12 years of sleep. Seeing the beggar, the king dismounted from his horse and thought to himself, "Perhaps this beggar's prayers will fulfill my heart's desire." With this thought, he sat beside the beggar and began to gently massage his feet. Since the beggar had completed his 12-year sleep, as soon as the king began massaging his feet, the beggar awoke. He opened his eyes and saw a king sitting beside him, massaging his feet. The beggar thought to himself, "I wonder how long this poor soul has been sitting here, massaging my feet and serving me." He was very pleased with the king's service and asked, "My son, what is your wish?" The king, folding his hands, replied, "O venerable one, I have no children. Please pray for me that God may bless me with a child." The old beggar looked at him carefully, and, pointing to the king's lavish clothes and grandeur, said, "God has given you a kingdom and wealth. What more do you desire?" Upon hearing this, the king grabbed the beggar's feet, and, with tears in his eyes, said, "I do not want wealth, nor honor, nor this kingdom. I only want a son. This is my only wish." The beggar's heart softened. He looked away for a moment and then said, "Go in that direction. There you will find a mango tree. Shake it twice and pick the mangoes that fall." The king immediately stood up and, following the beggar's instructions, went in the direction he pointed to. He didn't have to go far before he saw a mango tree full of fruit. He grabbed a branch and shook it with force, causing 6 mangoes to fall. He remembered that the beggar had said to shake the tree twice, so he grabbed the branch again and shook it harder. This time, only 1 mango fell. He carefully wrapped all 7 mangoes in cloth and went back to the beggar. Presenting the 7 mangoes, he said, "The first shake made 6 mangoes fall, and the second made only 1 fall. These are the 7 mangoes." The beggar took the 7 mangoes from the king and said, "Go, take these homes. Give 1 mango to each wife. If God wills, each of them will bear a child." Hearing this, the king was overjoyed. He bade farewell to the beggar and hurried back to his palace. When the king reached his palace, he was ecstatic. He gathered his 6 wealthy queens and said, "God has answered our prayers. We will no longer be childless." He then gave each queen a mango and said, "Eat this. A beggar told me that it will make your wombs fertile and bless us with children." In his immense happiness, the king forgot that the beggar had given him 7 mangoes and had instructed him to give 1 mango to each queen. He gave mangoes to 6 of the queens, but left 1 behind. He did not even think about giving the mango to the poor queen who lived in the humble hut. After handing out the mangoes, the king returned to the palace, while the queens thought to themselves, Is it really possible to have children just by eating a mango? Surely the beggar must have tricked the king. They didn't believe him at all. Therefore, they did not eat the mangoes, but threw them behind the palace in the backyards. Somehow, word of this reached the poor queen. She heard that the king had brought 7 mangoes from a beggar, and the other queens had thrown them away without eating them. As soon as she heard this, she called her servant and told him, "Go to the back of the palace and pick up all the mangoes that have fallen there." The servant immediately went and found 7 mangoes scattered around the backyard. He collected them and brought them to the poor queen, saying, "Your Majesty, these 7 mangoes were lying in the back of the palace, so I have brought them to you." The queen took the mangoes and, once the servant had left, ate all of them one by one. Afterward, she resumed her normal routine in her humble hut. 3 months passed, and by the grace of God, one day, the queen suddenly felt a change in her body. She immediately called for a servant and asked him to bring a midwife. When the midwife arrived and examined the queen carefully, she informed her, "Your Majesty, you are going to have a child." This was wonderful news for the queen. She asked the midwife again, "Are you sure?" The midwife replied, "Yes, Your Majesty. My experience never deceives me." Hearing this, the poor queen bowed her head in gratitude to God. Coincidentally, just as the midwife was leaving the queen's hut, the king passed by the area. When he saw the midwife leaving the queen's hut, he stopped and ordered his servants to find out what was happening. When the servants returned and reported that the queen was expecting, the king's joy knew no bounds. He immediately ordered that the midwife be permanently assigned to care for the queen. He then returned to the palace, happily announcing the good news. From that point on, he visited the poor queen every day, and he also appointed servants to ensure she lacked nothing. Meanwhile, the 6 wealthy queens, upon hearing that the poor queen was expecting, became consumed with jealousy and resentment. They said to one another, "This is a big blow. If she has a child, our dignity will be ruined." One of them said, "The king will forget all of us and will only care about her." Another said, "And her son will be the future ruler." A third said her son will have authority over all the palaces. The fourth said, "We will lose all our wealth." The fifth said, "We will become worthless in the king's eyes." The sixth said, "We will be reduced to nothing in the king's eyes." Together they devised a plan to ensure that the poor queen would not give birth. They agreed that no matter what, the poor queen must not have a child. After consulting with each other, they came up with a devious plan. They sent their servants to summon the midwife and said, "We want you to do a favor for us, and in return, we will give you anything you desire." The midwife replied, "Tell me what you want, and I will surely do it." The queens then said, "We want you to kill the poor queen's baby as soon as it is born, but do so secretly, without anyone finding out. If you do this for us, we will reward you handsomely." The midwife hesitated for a moment, but greed overcame her, and she agreed. "As you wish, I will do as you command." The queens gave her a large reward and promised to give her even more later. Meanwhile, the poor queen, unaware of the other queens and the midwife's conspiracy, was counting the days of her delivery. The king, too, was eagerly waiting for the moment when he would finally be called a father, and his long-held wish would be fulfilled. And then the day arrived, the one everyone had been waiting for. The clever midwife went to the poor queen for her delivery and said, "Your Majesty, since this is your first child, it is considered a good omen if I tie a cloth over your eyes. It will be very beneficial for the baby." The poor queen had no idea about the midwife's trick, so she did not object and said, You know better than me. Do whatever you think is best." The midwife cleverly tied the cloth over the queen's eyes and then began to make preparations for the delivery. The queen gave birth to 6 sons and 1 daughter. The cunning midwife quickly wrapped all 7 children in a large piece of cloth and, in no time, threw them into the nearby field so that they wouldn't survive. After doing this, the midwife rushed back to the queen and sat beside her. After a while, she removed the cloth from the queen's eyes. When the queen saw that the children were not there, she asked the midwife, "Where is my baby?" The midwife, showing her a piece of iron, said, "Your Majesty, you are very unfortunate. Instead of a baby, an iron piece was born." The poor queen was stunned. She had dreamt of a son, but now, in front of her, lay a piece of iron mocking her. She was devastated, but what could she do? She simply shed a few tears and remained silent. On the other hand, when the king was informed that the queen had given birth to a piece of iron instead of a child, he was filled with disbelief, shock, and anger. He said, "I have never heard of such a strange thing, that a woman would give birth to a piece of iron. How is that possible?" But the midwife, bowing her head, said, "Your Majesty, I am telling the truth. You can see the piece of iron with your own eyes." The king, deeply disappointed, thought to himself, "This queen must surely be unlucky for me. From today, I will have nothing to do with her." The midwife then left the queen's hut and went to the other wealthy queens, sharing the entire story with them. They were all thrilled and rewarded the midwife with a great gift, sending her away satisfied. The queens were now content and happy, but perhaps they did not know that God had other plans. The field where the midwife had thrown the 7 children belonged to a poor farmer. When the farmer's wife came into the field, she saw the 7 newborn babies lying there, all still alive. It was a strange coincidence that the farmer and his wife had no children of their own, and they longed for children. When the farmer's wife saw the 6 boys and the girl lying in the field, she thanked God, saying, "God has given us children too, and He has heard our prayers." She gathered all the children and took them home. When the farmer returned from his work and heard the story from his wife, he was overwhelmed with joy. He had been longing for children for many years, and now he was overjoyed to see 7 children at once. The farmer and his wife took great care of the children, raising them with love. In this way, the 6 boys and 1 girl, the poor queen's children, grew up in the home of the poor farmer. Time passed, and the 6 princes and 1 princess grew up. They were now old enough to play and run around, and the farmer and his wife were like parents to them. The children were all very beautiful, and anyone who looked at them could immediately tell that they were the children of a king. Somehow, the news of this reached the ears of the other 6 queens, who were now suspicious. They heard about the 7 children, the ones who had been thrown into the field by the midwife, and that they were still alive. They summoned the midwife and asked, "Didn't you kill those children?" At first, the midwife said, "Yes, I killed them." However, when the queens were told that the children were now living at a certain farmer's house and had grown, the midwife finally admitted everything. She explained that instead of killing the children, she had thrown them into a field. Hearing this, the queens told the midwife, "Now that everything has happened, the only thing left is for you to permanently get rid of all 7 children." They promised her even more riches if she managed to kill them. "We will give you all the jewels we have if you succeed in killing them," they said. Upon hearing the offer of jewels, the midwife quickly agreed. "Don't worry, I will take care of it," she said, Afterward she returned home, prepared some sweet bread, and mixed poison into it. She then went to the field where the 7 children usually played. When she arrived, she saw the children playing near a well with clay toys that the poor farmer had made for them. The midwife approached them and kindly called out, "Look, children, I have brought sweets for you." The innocent children eagerly rushed to her, and the midwife gave them the poisoned bread. "Here, I've brought these sweet breads for you. Eat them." The children, tempted by the sweets, began eating the bread. However, as soon as they finished eating, they all suddenly collapsed and died on the spot. When the midwife saw that all the children were dead, she quickly ran away, went back to the queens, and told them, "I have finished them all." In response, the queens rewarded her with precious jewels and felt content, thinking that there was no longer any threat to their position. Meanwhile, when the farmer and his wife realized that their children hadn't returned after playing, they went to the well to search for them. They were horrified to find the 7 children lying dead near the well. Near the bodies were 2 or 3 sweet breads, which made the farmer and his wife understand that the children had been poisoned. The farmer's wife sat down, crying in grief, but the farmer, desperate, set off into the forest in search of the old beggar, the one who was rumored to be very wise. It was his good fortune that he soon found the old beggar. The farmer joined his hands and pleaded, "Babaji, someone has poisoned my 7 children and killed them. Please help me." As soon as the beggar heard his plea, he quickly cut one of his fingers, let a few drops of blood fall into a small bottle, and handed it to the farmer, saying, "Quickly, go and sprinkle these blood drops on the children. You must return as soon as possible." There should be no delay. The farmer hurried back to the well. Following the beggar's instructions, he sprinkled 1 drop of blood on each of the 7 children, and, miraculously, the children came back to life. The farmer and his wife hugged them in joy, then took them back to their home, where they lived happily ever after. A few days later, word reached the queens that the children were alive and living at the farmer's house. The news greatly disturbed the queens, as they had been under the impression that the children were dead. They once again summoned the midwife and asked, "Haven't you killed the children yet?" The midwife replied, "Your Majesty, I gave them poison, and they are all dead." The queens, furious, retorted, "But they are alive and living at the farmer's house." The midwife was stunned. She couldn't understand how the children could still be alive. The midwife agreed, but now she faced a challenge. She couldn't give the children sweet bread again, as they knew the trick. The children had already been deceived once and would not fall for it again. It was difficult for the midwife to deceive the children again. She was in a dilemma, but after a while she came up with a new plan. This time she made ladus, sweet balls, and poisoned them. She then went to the well where the children played, and they were there once again. She approached them, and sweet-talking them said, "Look, children, I've brought something for you." She placed the poisoned ladus in front of them. At first, the children hesitated, as they knew that it was the same old woman who had previously tricked them with sweet bread. But when they saw that these were ladus and not bread, they were deceived again. The innocent children, forgetting the past, eagerly ate the ladus. No sooner had they eaten than they all fell dead. The midwife, seeing this, quietly returned and reported to the queens, "This time I have finished them off. They will never be alive again." The queens were overjoyed and rewarded the midwife handsomely, thinking that the threat had been permanently removed. Once again, they felt secure in their positions. Meanwhile, when the poor farmer and his wife saw that the children had still not returned, They went to the well with anxious hearts. To their horror, they found the 7 children's dead bodies lying there. The farmer's wife collapsed in despair at the sight, but the farmer, remembering the old beggar, thought that perhaps he could help them again. He rushed off into the forest to find him. The farmer eventually found the beggar and told him the whole story. He pleaded, "Please help me. I have nothing left but these children. For the sake of God, do something." The beggar listened to his plea, then replied, "My son, I feel for you, but I can do nothing now." The farmer, crying, fell at the beggar's feet and begged, "Please, Babaji, do something. These children are my only life." The beggar was moved by his plea, but said, "I can't bring them back to life again. However, you can do one thing. Bring the bodies here to me." The poor farmer had no choice but to obey. He ran back, brought the bodies of the 7 children, and said, "Here are the bodies, Babaji." The beggar called him over and pointed to the ground. "Now, dig 7 graves here, and an 8th grave in the middle," he instructed. The farmer began digging, and when he had dug the 8th grave, he returned to the beggar and said, "I have dug the 8 graves as you told me." The beggar said, "Now, bury the children in the 7 graves, and in the middle grave bury me." The farmer did as instructed, burying the children in the outer graves, and the beggar in the middle one. He then returned to his home. Time passed, and by God's will, after some time, a miraculous event occurred. 6 of the graves where the boys were buried sprouted mango trees, while the grave of the girl blossomed into a beautiful rose bush with exquisite flowers. The grave where the old beggar was buried sprouted a jasmine plant that flourished beautifully. While all the plants were lovely, the roses were especially beautiful, larger and more vibrant than anyone had ever seen before. One day, a few of the king's servants passed by and saw the mango trees growing on 6 of the graves, with jasmine and rose bushes on the other 2. They were struck by the beauty of the roses and tried to pick them, but the flowers were so tall that no one could reach them. As they tried to pick the flowers, a voice came from the rose grave, "My dear brother, should I let them pick the flowers?" In response, the voices from the 6 graves with mango trees spoke in unison, "Dear sister, ask the beggar in the jasmine grave." The voice from the jasmine grave replied, "No, only a real mother can pick these flowers." When the king's servants heard the voices coming from the graves and saw the flowers growing taller, they were greatly surprised. They had never seen or heard anything like this before. They rushed to the king and reported, "Your Majesty, we have seen something extraordinary. Please let us tell you about it." The king, intrigued, asked them to explain. The servants told him everything, and after hearing their story, the king was filled with astonishment. But how could this happen? He wondered aloud. The servants suggested, "Your Majesty, you should come and see it with your own eyes." The king agreed, and accompanied by his courtiers, he went to the place where the servants had told him about. Upon arrival, he saw that indeed 6 of the graves had mango trees growing on them, 1 had a jasmine plant, and 1 had a rose bush with many beautiful large blooms. The king had never seen such beautiful and large roses before. As he moved closer, he reached out to pick a flower. But as soon as his hand approached, the flowers grew taller, making it impossible for him to reach them. Then a voice came from the grave with the roses. "My dear brothers, should I let the king pick the flowers?" Immediately, 6 voices responded from the graves with mango trees. "Dear sister, ask the beggar in the jasmine grave." The voice from the rose grave then asked, "Should I let the king pick the flowers?" The response from the beggar's grave was, "No, Only a true mother can pick these flowers." At that moment, the king remembered the old beggar who had given him the 7 mangoes for his queens. He suddenly realized that there was something more to this story. He ordered his servants to bring all 6 of his queens to the site. As he suspected, they were connected to this mystery. In a short while, the 6 queens arrived, the ones who had conspired with the midwife to kill the children. The king instructed one of the queens to approach and try to pick a flower. However, as soon as she tried to pick a rose, the flowers lifted so high that she couldn't reach them, and the same voices were heard again. "My dear brothers, should I let my mother pick the flowers?" The response from the beggar's grave was, "No, she is not your true mother." One by one, the king asked the other queens to try to pick the flowers, but each time the flowers grew out of reach, and the same voices echoed, stating that only a true mother could pick the flowers. Finally, the king realized the truth and asked for the poor queen, the one he had long forgotten, to be brought. When she arrived, the king asked her to step forward and try to pick the flowers. Nervously, the poor queen stretched her hand toward the roses. To everyone's astonishment, the flowers bent down toward her and spread around her head like a crown, enveloping her. At that moment, the beggar's grave split open, and the beggar, alive and reciting the Quran, emerged. As he stood up, the other 6 graves opened, and 6 handsome young men and 1 beautiful young woman stepped out, revealing themselves to be the true children of the poor queen. The king, his courtiers, and the queens stood in shock, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The old beggar then narrated the entire story from the beginning, explaining how the innocent children had been wronged by the wicked queens and the midwife. The king was filled with remorse. He immediately apologized to the poor queen, and, in a tearful reunion, the children embraced their true mother. The king then ordered that all 6 of the cruel queens be executed, along with the midwife who had poisoned the children. The beggar lovingly kissed the children's foreheads and left the palace, returning to the forest. The king, now united with his true family, returned to the palace with his children and the poor queen. They lived happily ever after, and the old farmer and his wife, who had raised the children, were honored and allowed to live in the palace as well. Thus, the cycle of cruelty and deception was broken, and love and justice triumphed.